Hello, I'm Rafi from Global Thought and Awareness Broadcast. Our website is globaltab.net. And today we are here with Aneela Shahzad. Hello, Aneela.
Hi, Rafe. How are you?
Thank you, Aneela. I'm great. Aneela Shahzad is a geopolitical analyst, and today she's here to discuss with us the Iraq War. So, just to understand Iraq better, can we start from discussing about Saddam? I remember George Bush famously saying Saddam Hussein is a homicidal dictator who's addicted to weapons of mass destruction. It seems that his recklessness with the WMDs led to Iraq's invasion. So, my first question to you is isn't it sad that Iraq had to bear the murderous dictatorship of Saddam Hussein?
I agree. Saddam was a dictator in the sense maybe that he was having himself re elected all the time. And yes, there have been a lot of killings in his time. But we must not set aside the fact that all the killings of perhaps thousands and thousands happened prior to 1992. And you know that Iraq was engaged in a 10 years long war with Iran in all that time. And when you're in a war at the fronts, you can't afford internal threats too. And the way you conduct things can be different in war times. So basically, the Kurds, separatists, and the Shia uprising were somehow so difficult for Saddam that he couldn't handle them in a humane way. And sadly, he used the WMDs that the US gave him on his own people. And we should not justify any of those killings. But after the war, there has not been any large account of killings by the Iraqi government. In fact, in 2004, the Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that the US war in Iraq was not a humanitarian intervention because of the reason that presently no mass slaughter or genocide was going on in Iraq. And to answer Saddam's recklessness, Saddam actually cooperated fully with the UN weapons inspectors.
Do you mean to say that after the Iran-Iraq war, things were all good in Iraq?
No, things were not good at all after the war. Perhaps a little history would help understand. What happened was that when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in Iraq in 1979, he immediately nationalized the oil and ousted the British Oil Company. And at this, the British and the US instigated Saddam to wage war on Iran and helped him with weapons and even gave him the WMDs. Saddam wanted to fight Khomeini because he thought that the Iranian revolution would ultimately come to Iraq. But the day the war was over, the US turned bitterly against Saddam, first destroying all his battle power in the Gulf War and then putting severe sanctions on him on the pretext that he had the WMDs and that he was a murderer of his people. But the fact is that it was the sanctions that brought death and starvation upon millions in Iraq. As early as in 1997, UNICEF said that over 870,000 children have died because of sanctions. And you can imagine how many would have died up till 2003. Dennis Headley, the UN humanitarian coordinator, called these sanctions an intentional genocide.
So, would you like to imply that in this whole decade, even before the 2003 US invasion, Iraq was becoming weaker?
Yes, absolutely. The sanctions were so severe that Iraq could import even food and medicine in very limited amount. After the Gulf War, the US bombed Iraq routinely to weaken Saddam, but the media was blank on all that, and the whole nation was starving and getting sick. Infrastructure was badly damaged, and on top of all that, the US bombed Iraqi settlements with depleted uranium, as reported by UN observers in 1998. This uranium caused cancers in the population and especially in newborn babies. So, when Saddam had stopped killing his people, it seems that the US started killing them in a genocidal way.
We also hear that all the accusations regarding WMDs were not true.
Not only the WMDs, Bush even lied to the world and to the American people that Iraq had acquired uranium from Africa and that it was just 6 months away from making a nuclear weapon. All this was proven to be false later on.
But they did invade Iraq with the UN's consent. On the other hand, Saddam, instead of submitting to the UN, was threatening Bush by saying that if God wanted, we will fight them with daggers, swords, sticks, if other arms were scarce.
No, in fact, Kofi Annan later said that the invasion was illegal and that the UN Security Council had not sanctioned it. Actually, the US bullied the UN on this too. They said that they would attack even if the UN doesn't agree, and they did. And on the other hand, Saddam allowed free hand to the UN inspectors for searching the WMDs, which they clearly said that they did not find. And you're right, Saddam did say that he would fight back with sticks and daggers because that was all Iraq had to fight back with.
That is sad they didn't find the WMDs, but at least they helped rid the Iraqi people from a dictator like Saddam and brought democracy, don't you think?
Let's just put aside the question of what kind of a dictator Saddam was, comparing to all the other brutal dictators around the world that the US has always been championing. Let's just see what kind of democracy the US has brought to the people of Iraq. We don't have exact figures, but roughly at this time, Iraq is 50% Shia and 50% Sunni. But the parliament in Baghdad is over 90% Shia and the rest is Kurdish representation. What happened to the Sunnis then? Is that democracy? And the way the US led or in fact aided the creation of ISIS and Daesh in Sunni areas, rendering them as constant battlefields, seems to be an organized genocide for the Sunnis of Iraq, while the Shia government in Baghdad freely collaborates with Iran. The Iranian General Soleimani, who is the head of the Iran's Quds force, has been seen all around Iraq organizing battles against the ISIS. Now, what on earth does a general of Iran, that is the most spelled out enemy of the US, do in Iraq, a place occupied and controlled by the US? And okay, if the US has no control in an ISIS controlled area, it must have control on Baghdad. And Baghdad is the one who called in the Iranian forces.
There have been estimates as high as of 3 to 5 million Iraqis that have been killed in this war. That would definitely dwarf what Saddam had ever done, but is there some authenticity to these numbers?
You're right. It's really not easy to authenticate these numbers. Different sources give very different numbers, but a moderate estimate is that the sanctions from 1990 onwards killed 1.7 million and the war killed around 1.5 million. But again, there is little means to find the real numbers in a country that has been a war zone for over 13 years. Unless there is peace and several different neutral organizations can make fact-finding, we can't really be sure.
What do you think were some of the positives that came out of the US-Iraq invasion?
Well, the first good is obviously the death of over 3 million Iraqis. And secondly, the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which had no previous record in Iraq. We never heard of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Saddam's time. And once the war broke, it was like Al-Qaeda was more successful in occupying territory in Iraq than the US. This was actually deliberate, and that was the plan from the beginning, because you see, a few hundred or even a few thousand of Al-Qaeda fighters could never outdo the US military machine. It's the world's strongest armed force, and they couldn't have done it if they didn't want them to. And later, just to confuse people, Al-Qaeda changed names to Daesh and ISIS, and new leaders took to the dice. But it was really the Al-Qaeda network all along. Actually, the plan was to move the insurgency from Iraq to Syria and balkanize both countries. And until that end would be achieved, the civil war could not be allowed to pacify.
All right, so where do you see Iraq in the next 10 years or so?
It's really sad to think about the Iraqi people. Even as we compare them with the Syrian people, the Syrians had a leader they didn't like. But at least they had a leader and they stood behind him when they were attacked. Assad is an Alawite ruling a Sunni majority, but hopefully they will learn to accommodate each other, and in time the Sunnis will be back in power through the democratic way. But not the Iraqis. You see, if you have given all the powers to the Shia there, this is the start of their era and their fruit of war. So they will do anything to keep this power, even if it means genocide of the Sunnis, which in my view is already happening. So this is really very sad. Actually, the US has practically closed all the chances of any possible democracy in Iraq.
Thank you for your time, Aneela. You can read more from Aneela Shahzad at globaltab.net.